In 1994, CBS News picked up a story by Ted Sampley in the U.S. Veteran Dispatch, claiming that X-26 was Blassie. When the subsequent investigation by CBS uncovered evidence corroborating Sampley's claim, Blassie's family petitioned the Department of Defense to examine it. This time, mtDNA fingerprints from the unknown's bones were found to match those of Blassie's mother and sister. 20 years after his death, Blassie came back to St. Louis. Standing beside the gravestone, his mother was able to say, "My son is home. My son is finally home." The Department of Defense has since established the Armed Forces Repository of Specimen Samples for the identification of remains. Blood samples are taken and DNA isolated from all new members of the military, both those on active duty and reservists. By March 2001, the repository contained more than 3 million samples. I was on my way to my office when I heard that a plane had crashed into one of the World Trade Center towers. Like many others, I assumed initially it was an accident. Anything else was unimaginable. But all too soon, when the second plane hit the other tower, it was apparent that a criminal act of the most ghastly kind had been perpetrated against thousands of innocent people. No one who watched that day is likely ever to forget the images of people leaning out of windows high on the towers or falling to their deaths. And we were not shielded from the tragedy's immediate toll even on the tranquil campus of Cold Spring Harbor Laboratory, 30 miles from Manhattan. 2 of our staff lost sons that day. The final loss of life has been reckoned at 2,792, an extraordinarily low number considering that as many as 50,000 may have been in the towers at the time of the attack. Nevertheless, given an event of such cataclysmic force, one can expect to find few bodies intact, much less alive. And so the search for survivors was transformed with a tragic inevitability into the hunt for remains. 1 million tons of mangled steel, pulverized concrete, and crushed glass were sifted for any human part they might yield. Some 20,000 were found and taken to 20 refrigerated semi-trucks arrayed near the medical examiner's office. Since the beginning of this Herculean forensic effort, many identifications have been made using dental records and conventional fingerprints. But as the easy cases are closed, increasingly the load shifts to DNA analysis. For comparison with all genetic traces from the site, relatives have supplied either samples of their own blood or items like the toothbrushes and hairbrushes of the dead. Any possession that may have picked up even a few of its owner's cells from which DNA could be extracted. The task of carrying out the DNA fingerprinting has fallen to Myriad Genetics in Salt Lake City and Celera Genomics, both of which are accustomed to analyzing DNA on an enormous scale. But even with the very latest technology, this is a slow and painstaking process. It is a common human desire to know one's forebears, who they were, and where they came from. In the United States, a nation built by generation after generation of immigrants, the longing is especially intense. In recent years, the genealogical craze has been aided by the World Wide Web, which also supplies us with an informal measure of the phenomenon's dimensions. A Google search for a genealogy yields over 10 million hits. A search for DNA gets you only 5 million. By comparing the fingerprints of individuals, DNA makes possible the highly specific sort of genealogical inquiry that Gill and Ivanov carried out to recover, for instance, Anna Anderson's relationship to the Romanovs. None. But genealogies can also be constructed at a broader level, finding connections by comparing the DNA fingerprint of an individual with those of whole populations. At Oxford, Brian Sykes used DNA analysis to delve into his own genetic history. Knowing that both surnames and Y chromosomes are transmitted down the male line, he surmised that all men born with the same surname should also have the same Y chromosome, the one belonging to the very first man to take that name. Of course, this linkage of Y chromosome and surname breaks down if a name should arise independently more than once. If men change the family name for one reason or another, or if many boys take the name of a man other than their biological father, a lad secretly sired by the milkman, for instance, would likely wind up with the surname of the mother's husband. After contacting 260 men called Sykes, Professor Sykes managed to collect 48 samples for analysis. He found that about 50% of the Y chromosomes were indeed identical to his own Sykes chromosome. The rest bore evidence of conjugal lapses on the part of more than one Mrs. Sykes of generations gone by. Because the origin of the name is documented and can be dated to around 700 years ago, it is possible to work out the per-generation rate of infidelity. It averages out to be a perfectly respectable 1%, suggesting that 99% of Sykes' wives in every generation managed to resist extramarital temptation. When Sykes set up a company to market genealogical DNA fingerprinting services, one of his first clients was the John Clough Society, whose members traced their ancestry back to a Briton of the same name who emigrated to Massachusetts in 1635. The society even knew that an ancestor of his, Richard, from the Welsh line of the family, had been knighted for his deeds on a crusade to the Holy Land. What they lacked, however, was any historical proof to link their families to those on the other side of the Atlantic. Sykes' company analyzed Y chromosome DNA from the Massachusetts Cloughs and from a direct male descendant of Sir Richard. The two were indeed identical. Vindication for the Massachusetts branch. But not all the American Cloughs were as lucky. Society members from Alabama and North Carolina were found to be unrelated not only to Sir Richard, but to the Massachusetts Cloughs as well. On the Montel Williams Show, or Ricky Lake, or Jenny Jones, you can see the young women and men looking nervous. The host opens an envelope, gives the couple a meaningful look, and then reads the card. The woman covers her face with her hands and bursts into tears, while the man leaps into the air, pumping his fist. Alternatively, the woman leaps to her feet, pointing triumphantly at the man who remains slumped, shoulders bowed, in his seat. In either case, we have just seen one of the more outlandish applications of DNA fingerprinting, the ultimate